mentioned, I'm joined here tonight by John Wik. We're going to do a quick wrap-up of today's events and talk a little bit about Coastal. So, John, introduce yourself.
Well, I'm John Wik. I am the Director of Coastal Rowing for the United States Rowing Association, and I'm also the Director of Safe Sport. But I think we're going to be talking about coastal rowing. And Ryan, I think before we get started, just to give our audience and our listeners out there a little bit of an idea of what coastal is all about, we just came back, you and I both, from a very exciting event down in Sarasota, Florida. It was the first time we've had a major coastal event in Sarasota. It was completely done with FISA-class boats. It was a beach sprint, beach finish, and we've got some great film footage on this. Why don't we put that up and let your viewers take a look at it real quickly.
We're going to be running what's called the beach sprint, start and finish. You can see the flags over here, the checkered flag. One athlete from each crew will stand behind those checkered flags.
Treasure Coast girls that won the women's quad. So what we're in the quads, we had high school competitors.
We did.
It was a nice handful of Florida youth programs came out and built these quads. These are not kids that practice in coastal quads.
In
So
fact,
we
these were
introduced the day up.
These were all novices to the sport, all of the juniors that were in the boats. Those are the Ukrainian crew. And then we had some masters that ran some races earlier in the day.
So the shots that we see of the doubles and the singles, those are going to be adult competitors in those boat classes at this regatta. I took the crew from Chattanooga down. We had myself and 5 of the kids on the team raced as masters. Not a lot of eyebrows were raised about age handicap requirements.
We actually did away with the age handicap requirement. That's great. Your listeners and viewers get a little bit of an idea of what Coastal is all about. That was really a terrifically exciting event. And as you watch the video, you see the excitement and the gleam in those kids' eyes as well as in the adults' eyes.
Absolutely.
It's a different kind of a sport. No straight water to go down. Boats are allowed to crash into each other. Oars are allowed to touch. That's all part of the game. And you have to go around the buoys, just like you saw in the video. So we're pretty excited about this whole new aspect of our sport of rowing. It's something that we think is going to change the sport a little bit. And not only are we thinking that, but the International Olympic Committee is beginning to look at this as a possible Olympic sport in 2024 and then in 2028. And 2028 would bring it to the United States and Los Angeles. And that would be very exciting for us.
Absolutely, out at Long Beach. And I guess FISA is going to vote on that here in just the next couple months.
Well, actually, the International Committee will vote on it sometime during Tokyo. And then I believe that the FISA group will be presenting a proposal to them to consider bringing coastal rowing in as a replacement for another area of rowing. That would be lightweight rowing. At least that's the discussion on the street. We're not quite sure how all of that will turn out. But,
right.
No, I think the United States is at a position right now where we're actually behind the rest of the world in terms of coastal rowing. If you look at France, if you look at Sweden, if you look at Norway and England certainly, and Ireland and the Spanish folks, Spain, all of those countries are actively involved with developing the sport. Italy. Even Asia, there are good crews. In fact, the World Coastals were just held in Hong Kong, and they were a huge success over there. The first World Beach Sprints were held in China, and they were a huge success. Peru is involved with coastal rowing. So it's a sport that's grown around the world over the last 10 years. We're behind the ball. We have really not focused on this. We have only a handful of individuals who have really embraced the sport. A couple of them we know, Ben Booth up in Massachusetts, of course, and there's some crews coming in from California that have been involved. Vesper has been involved with going over to Monaco. They raced the Monaco event a couple of weeks ago. But it's growing here, and we're excited about trying to get the sport to grow properly.
Definitely. And I think when you say grow properly, that's really important. Because here we have an opportunity in our sport lessons learned from flat water racing and what works and doesn't work and what's going to keep athletes safe and developing properly. So I think that we, maybe being a little behind the curve, could prepare us advantageously to be better positioned to springboard.
Absolutely.
Right?
We can learn from our future competitors' mistakes.
Yeah.
We can take a look at the sport and we can look at some of the equipment that's out there, and we can make determinations as to how we might tweak that equipment. And that's being done here in the States. There's a group up in Massachusetts, Rebel Boats, that's beginning to come up with a new design for a coastal boat that's really pretty innovative. You've got folks down in Florida, Jim Henderson, who put on this event down in Florida. It was close to $250,000 worth of equipment sitting down on the beaches in Florida just for this event. Most of it was provided by Jim Henderson and his group, and kudos to them. What a great opportunity to develop a brand new sport. The boats that we had down there were mostly light boats, and then there were a couple of Felipes in the field. I think it's important that we get all of the boat manufacturers involved with this for coastal boats, as well as turn to some of the oar manufacturers. Those white oars that you saw were specially designed for coastal boats. They're coming out of Croker oar, and they recognize that the coastal oar had to be a little bit different than a regular flat water oar. Greg Doyle and I spent some time on Delaware Bay one day in a single working out different weights of oars to figure out which one would work best in a coastal boat.
Yeah.
And based on that, we came up with that white oar shaft that you see in the white oar.
And those are important. I mean, it's marketed to a large extent as a training oar, and none of that was new to Croker. And I think this is something that some people may know or may not, but like Australia, the surf boat rowing, which is different than coastal,
Yep.
but that's a pretty big sport there.
It's a huge sport.
And it's similar to kind of in the States, we probably the closest thing would be like the lifeguard game.
The lifeguard games, exactly. And we've actually talked to some folks along the Jersey coast who are very interested in getting involved with coastal. They recognize that this is another aspect of the sport that they're involved with, and that could be fun for them.
They're already doing it.
And
They've been doing it for over 100 years.
Just a different boat.
And so going back to the Sarasota event that just happened a couple weeks ago, it was a beach sprint style event. What's the other format of racing that we'll see in coastal rowing?
Well, let's talk about the two styles. One is the beach sprint, and I want to come back to that in just a minute. And then the other form is your standard water start. With a water start, you would have a boat out in the water and another flag, much like a sailboat regatta, and the athletes would line up in boats behind an imaginary line between those 2 points. The starter boat would have 3 balls raised up on the mast, and it would drop the balls one at a time. And as the last ball drops down, the athletes would begin to row across that imaginary line, just like in a sailboat regatta. And they would take off and then cross around all of the different buoys. Typically, a coastal event, FISA likes to see about 1,000 meters before you get to your first 90-degree turn. Now, we found that that's a long distance, and maybe you can modify that some. We found it advantageous in Sarasota to make the course a little bit smaller, but we tried not to do a 90-degree turn within that first 1,000 meters. The theory is that by keeping it straight, you allow the field of athletes to sort of position themselves, and that eliminates some of the crashes around that first buoy turn.
Some.
But
and dirt bike racing is a good example of a sport that has the whole shot is a very critical part of most dirt bike races.
I never thought about that. Absolutely, sure. You get that position, and then you're ready to go, and you're ahead of the field. As far as rules go for coastal, it's kind of interesting in that, yes, you are allowed to touch oars. You're allowed to crash boats together. Those are not necessarily penalties, unless it's a really intentional, egregious crash. That's, of course, not allowed. But the rules that are very interesting are the overtaking rules. If you're on a straight stretch of water, the boat that's being overtaken has to stay in its position. And the overtaking boat, as it comes within one boat length, is required to go around that boat.
Yep.
Now, that's different than what we do in a head race, right? The other interesting thing, though, is when you go to a turn and you're going around a buoy. In that instance, the boat that's being overtaken, as the overtaking boat gets within one boat length, has to yield way to the inside of the turn for the overtaking boat. So it gets a little bit complicated, and it takes a little bit more to explain some of this at what we call a captain's meeting. Unlike a CNC meeting at our normal regatta, In coastal rowing, you have a captain's meeting, and the reason it's called the captain's meeting is because these boats are considered to be ocean-going vessels.
Yeah.
Every ocean-going vessel is required to have a captain, some individual that is in charge of the boat. So we call these captain's meetings.
Absolutely. One, I guess, viewer's note to the quads is that it's not only a large rudder that has quite a bit of steering control of the boat, there's a dagger board as well. And the quads particularly are, with a little bit of boat speed, are extremely maneuverable. And there's definitely a learning curve there, comparing that to the flatwater racing coxswain, who's used to having really limited amount of real impact on the direction the boat's
Right,
going.
and they steer the regular fine boat rower with essentially a rudder the size of a credit card.
Right.
These things, as you saw when you were racing, have rudders that are about a foot long, and then they have the dagger board. And unlike in a fine boat, that dagger board has to get pulled out as you begin to go around the turn if you really want maneuverability. So the coxswain, of course, has to learn how to pull the dagger board and drop the dagger board in as is appropriate for those particular turns, and then work in some cases with a foot pedal instead of knockers or turning handles to give the boat some direction. We started to talk about starts, and we got through the water start, but I didn't get to the sprint, the beach sprint, and I wanted to come back to that. Beach sprints, as you saw in the video, can be one athlete standing on the beach. In the case of races, it was typically the coxswain, who would start out when the flag went down, run down to the boat and jump in. The rest of the crew were sitting in the boat ready to go. That is not necessarily the only way you do a sprint start. You can also have the athletes standing next to the boat, and when the flag drops, all of the athletes have to get into the boat, as well as the coxswain running down through the start-finish line. The reason we didn't do it that way in Sarasota was because there was a safety issue. As you found when you were down at the beach, the beach actually dropped off rather steeply, and if we were to require people to stand next to the boats, the bow would probably be underwater. Yep. So it just wasn't going to work out.
In contrast, had it been a shallower beach with a more standard break, then you would have wanted the crew outside the boat so that you wouldn't have to have a ton of handlers keeping it
and that's exactly the intention that we had when we started out. But coastal rowing, unlike traditional rowing, we feel we can change these small rules, safety reasons,
Absolutely.
As we go forward. And everything about rowing and sport in general is about safety, fairness, and a positive experience for the athletes that we serve. So we really have to focus on that, and particularly in coastal, because it's a little bit more dicey out there, and waves and breaking waves, and you've got big water and you're quite a ways out, and often the water's a bit colder, and you have control over what's happening with those boats.
But a lot of lessons to be learned from sailing. One piece of safety kit on the coastal boats that required is the bow line, which I think would surprise a lot of people at first, but when you think about it, that makes a lot of sense.
That's exactly right. And the purpose for the bow line is when you get in trouble, you want to have something that someone can reach, and it's a requirement not only to have the bow line, but it has to be within reach of one of the athletes in the boat so that you can throw that bow line to a support boat and they can tow you home. Other pieces of equipment that are unique to coastal rowing are life jackets. Each coastal boat is required to carry a life jacket for every member of the crew. And the coxswain, in the case of a cox quad, is actually required to wear the life jacket. Other members of the crew are not. In single, you're not required to wear a life jacket. Double, you're not required to wear it. The quad, the athletes or the rowers are not required, but the coxswain is always required to wear a life jacket.
You can't be part of the solution if you become part of the problem.
There you go.
But just to make sure we're being totally clear, those are the three classes of coastal.
They are.
Single, double, cox quad.
Yep.
You mentioned that Jim is with Lightboat. We got to plug him. The company out of France. And Swift also makes coastals. And then actually just the other day on Instagram, Filippi posted some pictures of their new hull design for the coastal single.
And correct, you saw Felipe boats in that. Those were the boats that had the dark hulls, the dark tops on them. And you saw the rest of the fleet was primarily light boats. I believe there was one Echo boat.
There was an Echo in the men's single.
Yeah, that was a surprise. But that was in there as well. You also have Your Diffusion. That's another manufacturer in France. You have Swift. You have Leo boats. You were rowing a Leo boat, as I recall.
Yep.
That's Mats Leo coming out of Sweden. And I think right now, between that group and then Rebel, which is developing their single up in Massachusetts, that's pretty much the field of manufacturers.
There are a couple, like Angus Boat Works out of the Pacific Northwest. I think he's got a row cruiser, which was really developed as like a touring boat,
Right.
but it is almost to spec for coastal.
Well, we
And
have to be
it's
careful
sold as
here.
a kit boat, right?
Yeah,
and
we have to make sure that these boats are spec'd to FISA standards.
exactly.
And that's what we're looking at when we start talking about coastal rowing. We're talking about FISA spec boats. Now, that doesn't mean that open water rowing can't have other classes of boats in it. And there's no reason that you can't run events of this type using a mixed fleet of open water boats. They could be your Aldens, the Ocean Shells. They could be the Maz 24 boats. They could be the bigger Mazes. They could be any number of boats that you might want to put on the water that are rowing. And we've even seen events like the Norwalk, Connecticut event that occurred this year, where we had a mix of coastal boats, regular Maz 24s. I think there were a couple of Aldens, and then a whole fleet of surf skis and kayaks. And everyone was together. There were about 175 entries in that event, and it was hugely successful. It ended with a big party on the beach. The folks up in Norwalk did a really good job. That was the Lighthouse to Lighthouse event.
Nice.
And then there was another event this past year. That was out in San Francisco. That was a coastal event. They did quite a bit of rowing out there, and as I understand, had USRowing referees. The event went off without a hitch. It was very successfully attended. So we've got a couple of events growing in the United States.
And with that growth, there's going to be questions. One of those I know came out of San Francisco is they have some clubs out there that are loaded with moss boats and people who row all year round in the bay. Well, when it's coastal class only, you have to have an answer for if you're going to include those other people in the open water boats.
Right.
But I think that an interesting note about the coastal boats is that a novice boat builder could build a FISA spec boat in their garage. And that's something we talked to Ben about actually on the show.
Actually, Ben did that.
Yep.
When I first met Ben some 5 years ago now, he was building boats in his backyard and he was rowing them. And I recruited Ben to come down to Pensacola as one of the first two members of the U.S. team that raced in that Pensacola International event. Jimmy Dietz was the other one. James Dietz, not Jimmy. The younger Dietz. Yep. So it's been interesting to watch this evolve over the last 5 years. The biggest problems that we have had, and they're now beginning to get solved, have really been equipment problems. Up until this event in Sarasota, we really haven't seen that many coastal boats in one place in the United States. So it's really significant in that instance. We've seen as many as 2 quads down in Sarasota. We finally had 4. I think that as we move forward, we will see more and more boats showing up at these events. And my hope is that as we begin to populate these events, we're able to use the European format where boats are available for rent at the location. These boats are so big and so heavy. And for your viewers who are not familiar, Coastal Quad weighs about 350 pounds or so. That's a big, heavy boat for people to move around. The single is 35 kilo, about 72 pounds, which is one of the concerns that a lot of individuals have approached me about. The boats are so heavy, even the singles and doubles, that it's difficult for people to car top them. And that begins to put limitations on the sport. So discussion about making lighter boats that we can add weight to meet the FISA spec. And that makes a huge amount of sense. I was actually able to row one of those about 2 months ago down in Florida. It was a light boat, and it was a weight about 50 pounds or so. And then you could add weight to meet the FISA spec. It was a pleasure to row that boat. That additional, or the loss of the 20 pounds was just great.
It depends on the sea state, I guess, to some extent.
That's true. I've talked to a number of athletes who have suggested that a heavy boat might be the better way to go. As you get into heavier seas, you want that extra weight. You want that extra mass in the boat to keep you moving forward. I've talked to other individuals who have talked a little bit about design and suggest that a better rocker on the boat would give it much better surfing capability down the backside of waves. So there are lots of ideas out there. I don't know whether that's a good idea or a bad idea. But, I think we're going to see Individuals come up with new innovative ideas for making these boats faster, more fun to row, and more seaworthy in heavier seas.
And they are already a lot of fun to row. And even if you're on flat water in them, you know, that one that I have, it's a beater. I got it cheap because it had been crushed and I've got tape holding it together. Actually, I had a flat tire on the way to Sarasota that knocked another chunk out of that boat. And so as I was rigging it, I was also taping it back together. But it gets rowed a lot on flat water. And as a heavier, stable boat, it's a great teaching platform.
They are very stable. I used to kid around when I rode my Leo down in Florida, down in Pensacola. I would get into the boat and I'd put one foot on it, and just sort of push off standing up and then sit down. And I know I've seen people do that in a fine boat, but not too many.
Well, it's a chance to practice it. You know, I think that it's going to be very exciting to see how coastal interplays with our fine boat rowing from the Olympic level over just the next 10 years, all the way down to our day-to-day operations with our community programs and just bringing new people into the sport and reminding people who are already in the sport why it's so much fun.
I think that's right. Yeah.
Would you like to help me with the drawing for the evening?
Sure.
All right. We've got our business card raffle box just over there. Can I get you to grab that?
Sure.
So we've got, if you're here at the convention or if you have an affiliate who's here at the convention that can drop one of your cards in our box, we have a raffle box here and we're doing prizes.
We're going to give away Mark's
prize.
Yeah.
This is a big one.
That's a huge.
What we got
Is
here?
a certificate for $100 off of any camp in the 2020 year with the All-American Rowing Camp. And so you can check out them on their website, allamericanrowingcamp.com. And
And the button.
and a bunch of course. So, John, no peeking.
No peeking.
Do the honors.
Am I going to know this person?
There's a good chance.
There's a good chance I'm stirring them up here. All right.
Our accounting firm has gone through this.
Uh-oh.
Who's that?
Uh-oh. Rowing Magazine.
Oh, my
Luke Reynolds.
Luke Reynolds.
Is going
is
to go
our winner
rowing.
tonight.
All right.
Good. Congratulations, Luke.
Well done.
John, thanks so much for being
Hey,
on the
my
show
pleasure.
tonight.
This has been fun. And, let's get out there and to your audience, anybody that wants to get involved with Coastal, give me a call. I'm at USRowing, or send me an email. You can find me at john.wik, W-I-K, at usrowing.org.
And we'll put that in the show notes as well.
Thanks. Enjoyed it. Thanks so much, guys.